Let me introduce Mr. Anirudh Suri. Clearly, Mr. Anirudh Lahiri is on my mind, but pardon my faux pas. I keep saying to err is human, to forgive divine. But let me welcome Mr. Anirudh Suri, Managing Partner at India Internet Fund. And we are talking to him as the author of this. I call it a seminal book. I don't use the word seminal ordinarily. I read it and I get excited about books. And when I started reading it, and there were some chapters which were so contextual, it was like as if it was written for what has happened in the last 3 weeks. And I'm talking to the Russian-Ukraine war or Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So let me welcome Mr. Anirudh Suri, who's the Managing Partner of the India Internet Fund. He doesn't really need an introduction. He's worked across the world on digital, on policy. He's worked in India, and he started a fund many, many years back to back Indian entrepreneurs. He's been invested in many companies that today are unicorns. And now he's written this book, which I would say really is a must read for anybody who's building a technology business or who's interested in, nations. It's called The Great Tech Game. And Anirudh, welcome to the BW Dialogue. I'd love you to hold the book and show it to our readers and viewers.
Sure. No, thank you so much, Anurag, for that very, very kind introduction about me as well as the book. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm looking forward to speaking with you.
It is very well produced too. It is not, and I'm not talking just of content in terms of production, in terms of the aesthetics, the book has come out well. But let me first dive in and ask you, how have been the last 24 months for you personally and professionally?
Sure. So I think that's probably the most pertinent question. I think the last 2 years have been a tough period, both personally for many of us, I think in India and the rest of the world. So I think it was a tough period personally, for sure, for all of us, including me. But and it required a lot of us to change, reflect, reset our life clocks in a way. And professionally, it's been a bit of a roller coaster. I think from a technology standpoint, I can say that the last 2 years have been quite a ride for the technology ecosystem in India. I think that the tech ecosystem in India for the last 2 years has really boomed. I think we've seen obviously the creation of many, many unicorns, but I think that there's a renewed energy in the entrepreneurial ecosystem now the last 2 years by virtue of both the infusion of capital, I think, Anurag, that has happened, partly because of the battle between the US and China. There has been a bit of a diversion, I would say, of focus away from China and towards India from the viewpoint of European and American investors. But I think even other than the capital, I think there's a renewed energy in the tech entrepreneurial ecosystem because digital adoption has really gotten a massive boost by virtue of people working from home and people realizing that in case of lockdowns, etc., digital technology has often come to the rescue of many consumers. So I think that professionally it's been a very good time from a tech standpoint, but I dare say that that might not be the case for some of the other sectors in our economy.
Absolutely. And Anirudh, you know the numbers, but just to support you, I mean, the retail investors in India were 1 crore before the pandemic 2 years back. They're 2.5 crores. And there are many reasons, but one of them is that technology-led business models helped more investors come in. They were at home, they had more time, they saved more, they were looking alternate source of income, multiple reasons, but the digital acceleration, and there are many apps like Zerodha. Zerodha offered a zero fee in investing. So clearly, even if you look at e-tailing, e-commerce, it has got a fillip. Possibly what would have taken a decade has definitely taken 2 years. Even in the US, which is the primary market for e-commerce, and because retailing market, 16% of the overall retailing 2 years back was online in the biggest market in the world. But that has become almost 30% in the last 2 years. So 16% in 20 years and almost 14% in 2 years. So just to kind of build on what you did, you know those numbers. Now, today we are talking to you because you've written this book, The Great Tech Game. Why this book? Why now? Or somebody could ask, why not earlier?
No, that's a good question, but why not earlier? But no, why this book? I think, Anurag, as you briefly alluded to when you were kindly introducing me, I've had the privilege, I would say, of having worked across multiple sectors over the last 2 decades, both in the US, the UK, and here in India, and spanning, business, policy, technology, venture capital, management consulting. And at each of these stages of my life professionally, I've seen technology from a different standpoint. When I was working in McKinsey in the US, we were, and this is back in the mid 2000s, we were starting to work with many companies that were getting replaced or displaced by Amazon and some of the emerging tech firms at that point, right? Whether they were bookstores or offline retailers. And at that point, I saw that kind of disruption that tech was bringing in. My time in the Indian government working in the IT ministry, I saw how important a policy framework was for really ensuring adoption and access to technology. And over the last decade or so that I've been in the tech VC world and the tech entrepreneurship world, I've realized how much that bottom-up entrepreneurial energy and talent has to merge with capital, right, which is a key resource, to really build companies at scale that can then transform consumer behavior and markets. And, at some point over the last 2 years, a lot of these pieces had been brewing in the back of my mind, Anurag, but I'd not had the time, I would say, to bring them all together into a coherent framework. And in some ways, COVID, by virtue of reducing my travel and a lot of the time-consuming activities that we used to be involved in the pre-COVID days, by virtue of that time freeing up and COVID being a great reset, as I was mentioning earlier, gave me the time and the mind space to step back and put a lot of those pieces together and put them together in the form of a book. And so that's really why now and why the book. It's my view that the big picture was really missing in both in India and the rest of the world, where we are obviously obsessed with the creation of unicorns and massive valuations of startups and things like that, which is fine. But I think that a big picture view of how technology is transforming geopolitics, how it's transforming the economic competitiveness of nations, not just individuals or corporates, but really nations as a whole, and the impact technology is having on our societal values and our societal structures. I think that big picture was missing from my standpoint. And so I thought it'd be a good idea to at least put together something that that's that straw man that I can put out there to start the conversations around that big picture view, so that we don't just stay myopically involved in the tech world, but get that big picture view also.
And you get that historical view on how the nations won, who dominated, why they dominated. I'll come to that in a while. But let me ask, why this title? Why have you called your book The Great Tech Game? It's not a game, it's not happening.
No, that's right. That's right. So, I'll actually explain the three individual words I've used and why that overall framework I think is helpful. I think that in the past, historically, there have been great games. The great game as a term, for people who've studied geopolitics or international relations, is often used in reference to the battle between Russia and the UK, Great Britain, at the time about 150 years ago, when they were battling it out for dominance of Central Asia. So at that point, people who were studying that battle between Russia and the UK for dominance of the heartland, so to say, of the Eurasian heartland, referred to that as the Great Game. I have obviously put a spin on that to say that now what we are living through is the Great Tech Game. And by that, I mean three things. One, when I say great because I think it's being played on a global stage. And it's being played across domains, across the geopolitical, economic, and societal domains. And it's being played out on the global stage. It's no longer about two actors. It's no longer about the US versus China, or the US versus the Soviet Union, or Russia versus Britain. It's really no longer a bilateral competition. I believe it's a global competition. The reason I say tech is because I think that tech lies at the core of this competition between nations around the world. And I'll explain that from an economic, geopolitical standpoint as well. And game, to be honest, I don't mean to use the word game to make this at all a non-serious issue. In fact, quite the contrary, right? I believe that it's actually a massively important dynamic playing out in the world. But I say game because I believe that there's many players involved in this, and there's a lot of strategy that's going to be involved in this competition, so to say, between these players. And so I use the word game to help us understand that this is a multiplayer game where strategy and tactics will end up being a key determinant of who ends up being a leader in this great tech game and who ends up being a laggard.
Okay, we'll come to your sections in the book and then the sections of chapters. But which is your favorite chapter and why? Or is there a favorite section?
So my favorite section, I'm a big fan of geopolitics and how it shapes our world. So I have to say, if it was one section, it'd be the geopolitical section, where I talk about how technology is shaping geopolitics and our world order. But really, I think my favorite chapter, if there is one, now this is like asking me if I have a favorite child, Annurag. So, but still, to answer that question, I would say my favorite chapter is probably the one that talks about the future of war and how this is really the golden age of cyber espionage. I think that doesn't get talked about as much in our mainstream media. Of course, we talk about valuations and the economic impact of tech. We talk about how tech is shaping maybe the world order today as well. But I think we don't talk enough about how
we talk about information wars and how information is pushed, but we don't talk about cyber. If I can use the word cyber intelligence and cyber espionage and cyber sabotage. I mean, what happened? There is a theory that the power grid that was taken off was because of load. But there is also a theory that it was done by an outside force. I mean, I don't have to name the force, but
no, that's right. That's
so
right.
clearly,
so I think,
go on.
No, I absolutely agree with you. I think that whether it's that power grid example that you rightly refer to, whether it's the fact that we've had several instances globally of today we are such a device-driven society, both as individuals and as organizations, and these devices are very much prone to being tapped and tracked. And in fact, I have a very interesting historical story about the Telegraph Networks in that section, where I talk about how even 100 years ago, around the time of World War I, the telegraph network that had been laid out around the world by Britain and the other colonial powers of that time to facilitate communication between the headquarters, so to say, of these colonial powers and their colonies in the rest of the world, how these telegraph networks were initially laid out for communication purposes, but ultimately became geopolitical and war-driven tools. So in World War I talk about the story where, to gain an advantage against Germany, Britain, which had probably the most dominant control of these telegraph networks, both in terms of the fact that their companies were manufacturing these telegraph networks, were the ones responsible for repairing them if there were breakdowns, etc. They cut off many of the telegraph cables that were connecting Germany to the rest of the world as a way to both disconnect their communications, but also to disconnect other financial networks that were powering their economies, right? So that these networks were used as a geopolitical tool when it came down to a conflict, even though they are otherwise in peacetime just used as economic facilitation tools. And so I draw parallels between that set of instances to today's world, where today we're not talking so much about the undersea cables that are the core internet infrastructure that has been laid under the seas, right? We don't talk about them as much. But if there is conflict, and it's seeming like there will be a lot more conflict in the coming years, right? As you alluded to in the case of Russia and Ukraine, that's a preview, in my view, of what's to come now. But these underwater cables, undersea cables that carry today over 95% of the internet traffic, and by logical extension, control all our internet communication, our financial networks, and even undergird our military communications and networks, ultimately these can be cut, disrupted in the case of conflict. So I believe that that's really my favorite section because of the massive geopolitical implications, but also the way we're not talking enough about it.
Absolutely. And you know what has happened in the last 3 weeks in Ukraine makes your book surreal, as I wrote to you in an email, and now I'm asking you that. You talk of tech shaping geopolitics and the destinies of nations. What is your comment now? And you know, one, I don't remember the chapter, but I read the chapter and which was about a certain internet company in Russia and how it was having issues. And then the state created a SPV to take a stake in it because, they kind of gave them a complete saying, take it or, there is something else in store for you. And look at how relevant that conversation is. So don't you feel your book is in some way ahead of time when you wrote it, though a lot of experts who understand the geopolitics as well as you do, and the play between commerce, technology, economy, and domination by countries. They've been talking about Russia's ambitions at least for the last 5 years, if not more. So tell me, what have you learned new in the last 3 weeks, and or what supplements what's in the book, or in some way it kind of fortifies what you have said in the book?
Yeah. So I'll no, thank you. I think that there are a
I'm
couple
talking
of things that come.
Zandex.
Yandex is the name of the firm.
Yeah, you talk about Zandex, and
So Anurag, I think that I'll share a couple of thoughts here. One, I think that I wrote in my book in the geopolitical section that there's obviously we've for the last 30 years lived in a largely unipolar world where the US has been the primary dominant economic military power. But that unipolar world is increasingly being challenged in the last few years by Russia and China. And the last 2 years had seen a dominant discussion being framed around China, right? That China, especially in the US, the conversation had moved very quickly to saying that China is our primary adversary, primary opponent on the world stage from a US standpoint. And Russia had sort of almost gotten relegated to a second tier adversary. I think that the recent events have shown that that's a statement that could not have been made lightly, right? That Russia remains an equally important adversary for the US on the global stage and even for Europe in particular. But more importantly, one of the things that I refer to in the book that is that a Russia-China alliance or a Russia-China partnership is probably the biggest, most consequential threat today for US to continue its dominance in the world. The Russians and Chinese have had a long, complex history. In the Cold War era, the Russians or the Soviet Union at the time were the intellectual flag bearers of communism. And the Chinese were viewed by them as secondary in that ladder. The Chinese obviously did not like that. Right? The Chinese under Mao, etc., wanted to be at least equals. And in that battle, the US was able to wean China away from the Soviet Union, and in the early 70s, make it an economic partner of the US and not so much of the Soviet Union. And I argue in my book that actually tilted the course of the Cold War in many ways. And even if at that time Soviet Union and the Chinese had stayed together, the US would have had a much tougher time. But weaning China away had been a big move that time for the US. And I argue that today, in many ways, Russia and China coming together is going to make things very difficult for the US. And I think that's playing out today, where now the US has a two-front battle on its hands. One, on the European front, where Russia is now no longer something that can be kept in the background, right? Russia is now very much up front and center, a big threat for the European nations as well. And so they cannot help the US when it comes to the Indo-Pacific as much, which is where the US was thinking that, they wanted to focus their effort on containing China or restricting China's expansion and economic growth. And so now the US has to figure out how to split its resources between the European front vis-a-vis Russia and the Indo-Pacific vis-a-vis China. And I think that's a master move in a way by the Chinese and Russians. And there's a theory that they've acted in concert, at least behind the scenes, in advancing the war in Ukraine. And if so, I think that it has been a good move from a Russian and Chinese standpoint, and a step back, I would say, for the US and Europe, which were hoping to really focus their energy and efforts in the Indo-Pacific. So that's one piece. The other piece is the nature of war. I think a lot of people have talked about the fact that Russia entered Ukraine with tanks and troops. And so a lot of people have talked about how this is harking back to the World War II days of tanks and troops, and that cyber war is not really playing out as people expected it might play out. My view is still different. My view is that while tanks and troops have obviously been front and center when the actual invasion or attack happened in Ukraine, behind the scenes and in preparation of that attack, the nature of war has been very different, right? One, in Ukraine, Russians have been playing out a cyber and information war for the last several years. That's one aspect to it. And second, if you look at the response this time from the West, from Europe and America, the nature of war has been very much a fintech war. You know, they've tried to remove Russian banks from SWIFT, right, the global payments platform. They've tried, all the big tech firms have withdrawn their services from Russia, right? And of course, there's been a massive information war being played out from the US and European side also to make sure that the dominant agenda or dominant conversation on social media has been pro-Ukraine and pro-West and not so much pro-Russia. So I believe that the nature of war is definitely hybrid, you know, where tanks and troops obviously play a role, no doubt, and air and missiles and troops will continue to play a role, but there is a massive tech component to it that's clearly playing out.
Okay, now let's move into your book and the parts, you know, you classified chapters in sections as parts. Now the part one is titled Insights from Great Games in History and has 3 chapters. Tell us, what are the lessons and insights that are even relevant today that you elucidate in those 3 chapters?
Yeah, so Anurag, in that first section where I talk about the insights from the great games in history, as I call them, I've tried to provide a historical narrative to help us contextualize what we're living through today. Right? My main argument is it's often very hard to take a step back and understand what you're living through, especially when you're living through such a transformative time. I use an example from a few centuries ago when the Gutenberg press was invented, and you're in media, so you'll appreciate this that much more. That when the Gutenberg press was invented, the implications of it were not appreciated at the time, but there were massive social, economic, religious implications of the Gutenberg press, the Reformation, the religious Reformation that ensued, the spreading of education and literacy across Europe, the Renaissance that followed in Europe, can all be traced back to, in many ways, to the Gutenberg press. But that time it was not appreciated, right? In the 1500s, that massive implication that simple thing could have was not understood as much. And so today I make the same argument that we have to have a very good understanding of the transformative era we are living through today. And for that reason, I provide this historical context in this section to say that we've lived through some 5 or 6 great games in the past. The Great Agri and Trade Game is the first chapter that I've described, and I'll come back to it. The Great Colonization and Industrialization Game is the one that I believe follows that Great Agri and Trade Game. And then I think most recently we've been living through the Great Capitalism and Technology Game that has seen the US as the winner. Each of these games, Anurag, has had 2 or 3 main implications. One, it has shaped the economics, the geopolitics, and the society of that time. Second, it has created new winners and losers each time. And third, the implications of those games we continue to see today, right? So the subsequent games that have come have built on the previous games, have not completely displaced those games, but have built on them. And I show how that's happened in this section. But let me start with the great agri and trade game that you've asked me about first. I believe that agriculture was really the first time we saw a massive transformation of human society from our hunter-gatherer origins, I would say, to a time when societies in their complex forms as we know them today really start to form, right? And many thinkers have written about it, whether it's Yuval Harari most recently or others, how settling down in agriculture really shaped the complex societies of today, where we started specializing into different professions, started, as I talk about it, started having surplus. So I talk about all of these eras from a geopolitical and economic standpoint. So I talk about how agriculture helped us create that first surplus. Surplus food meant now you could have different professions, but it also meant that we started having trade. And when we started having trade between nations and regions, this trade often happened either over land or over sea. You started having these choke points. And that's really what I call the genesis of geopolitics as we know it today. It was control of those choke points that became very important. Whoever controlled those choke points and those flows of goods became the dominant power of the time, whether it was the Egyptians, the Minoans I talk about. You have obviously the Venetians who controlled trade into Europe, right? And China, of course, that dominated, trade over land as well through the Silk routes. And so I talk about how today it's not that different. Now we are talking about trade of not of just of goods, but trade of data and flows of data. So whoever's controlling this key component of data and technology today, and the flows of this technology and data is controlling in many ways, the economic power of today, or the military power of today. As I was alluding, the undersea cables are nothing but flows of data. Whoever's controlling them has a big advantage. So I think one of the lessons from that great agri and trade game is that you've got to understand what flows and what surplus is out there, and how do you keep control of it, or at least secure your flows. That's one. The second is the concept of intermediaries. Venice and many players on the Silk routes used to keep the buyer and the seller separate. So you would not know where your silk was coming from. I talk about this anecdote in the book that, the Romans didn't know for a long time where their silk was coming from or what silk was made from. So there was this idea of an intermediary controlling information and the consumer. So today I talk about how there are digital intermediaries, right? Amazon and many such marketplaces are today bringing together buyers and sellers, but they're not letting them necessarily start to trade directly, right? So they've plumb themselves very nicely in the middle, and they are benefiting, right? They're benefiting massively. So social media is again another example. Facebook is technically connecting me and you, but really it's the big elephant in the room sitting and benefiting from being an intermediary. And that intermediary concept can be traced back all the way back to the great agri game. So there are many such lessons as I draw out in that in that chapter that exist for today's world if you study that great agri and trade game as well.
Thank you so much. Anirudh, let me also ask you, before we dive into the other chapter and I bring in Vasudha and Urvi into the conversation, how is India doing in this great tech game? Are we doing well? What are we doing well, and what can we do better?
I think that's a very pertinent question, Anurag. I think from an Indian standpoint, and that's partly why I've written this book. Also, I think that India has missed some of these great games in the past. We've missed the boat, so to say, in many of these great games. And I, as an Indian myself, I don't want India to miss out on this game, because the implications of that, I think, as we've been discussing, could be massive. For the next 100, 200 years, it could shape the destiny of our people and our society. And so the question of what India is doing well and what it can do better in this great tech game is probably the most pertinent one coming out of the book. And I, of course, have written out the broad contours of what a game plan for India could look like in the book. But let me lay out some of the main points for you and our listeners. I think we're doing many things right this time. One, we have a massive talent pool that obviously is equipped to innovate, to build companies, to build the software, the hardware of what is required in this great tech game. And we are seeing some of those signs. We are seeing many great Indian entrepreneurs around the world building great companies, right? And in India. And of course, we also have that managerial talent, right? In the form of, I don't have to name all the names, but Sundar Pichai, Satya Nadella, the list is endless really of global managers that are today managing global tech firms that are coming out of India. So I think we have the talent piece right this time. The second piece that I think that we are getting right this time around is the flow of capital, right? I talk about in the book, there are basically 3 or 4 key components or key factors of production that you need to win. One is talent, there's capital, there's tech, and then there's all the soft things like policy and strategy. So I think talent, I've spoken about. Talent, I think we are very well positioned on. There are improvements to be done still, but I would say largely we have that piece right. Capital, again, we are getting right. I've been in the tech VC world now for the last decade. I think India has seen a massive flow of capital coming in to fund this kind of entrepreneurship that we've been seeing unleashed over the last decade. So I think capital also we're starting to get right, though I would make one point there. We have to unlock a lot more of our domestic capital base to go into these enterprises, right? Innovative enterprises. We've had a lot of foreign capital, but we need domestic capital so that we can also see the returns of that capital stay on and trickle down into the Indian economy. Otherwise, we see a lot of the foreign capital obviously benefit from the tech innovation, but then that capital, of course, ultimately trickles back into those economies. But I think the talent and capital piece we have gotten right. The piece that I think we are still working on that we need to get better at, I would say, is the technology piece. And what do I mean by that? And then I'll come to the policy and strategy piece also. See, tech ultimately requires you to own core IP, core intellectual property, or for you to establish yourself as a key intermediary, as I was talking earlier, right, in the global tech ecosystem. So Amazon, Google, Cisco's of the world, they have developed technology as a moat that allows them to continue to get revenues and build, basically build cash balances that are in the hundreds of billions of dollars range, right? So we've been very good at tech services and of course at building tech marketplaces now, but we really need to focus on building core tech IP that is owned by Indian companies that allows them to build that moat and have serious business profits on their balance sheets. I think that part is missing still, right? And to do that, what do we need? We need to fund a lot more fundamental science and research in our country, both on the private sector side and on the public sector side. And the US and Korea and Taiwan and China have many examples that we can learn from on how to bring the private and public sector together to fund that kind of fundamental research and development in our country so that our labs, our companies are the hotbed of innovative research and innovation, whether in internet tech or in emerging areas like climate tech, biotech, and so on and so forth. So I would say that piece is still something we need to work on very much to make sure that we are beneficiaries of this innovation and not just participants. And then the final piece is the policy and strategy piece. I think that we need to, as a country, make sure that we are dynamic in our policy frameworks. We can't continue to apply industrial era policy frameworks to the great tech game. That's like saying that I'm going to not encourage industry because I want my artisanal economy and my, handcrafted economy to only flourish and not let industry come in. No, you have to let both flourish. Similarly, I think today's our policy frameworks have to understand that we have to adapt to what the new game is. Make sure our policy frameworks are dynamic, understanding that we have to have both these games coexist. We have to encourage industry, agriculture, of course, but we also have to make sure that the great tech game is something we win at, right? Otherwise, we lose out. So dynamic policy making is an important element that we still need to get better at. And then strategy. I talk about in my economic section that ultimately we have to have a strategy for what India's place or role in the global tech ecosystem will be. Do we want to just be a talent nation that's providing talent to the world, or do we want to be a tech nation? Right? One. Second, when we build out digital public infrastructure in India, like the UPI and Aadhaar, do we want that to just be for India, or is there a strategy there that we can build out to say that India will build out the digital operating system for the world, which Indian companies will build this marketplace of apps on top of and take to the world, so that we are building basically what an Apple has done with its iOS or Google has done with Android. Can we do something like that? Indian companies can take out this digital OS to the world and build that moat that I was referring to earlier. That to me, like, these are the elements of the strategy that India needs to think about so that we can be winners in the true sense and not just consumers or participants in the global tech economy.
Yeah, Urvi and Vasudha, you can come on, but I'll ask my last question and hand it over to both of you. Anirudh, we'll dive into your book again, but I want your commentary on the pricing and valuation of startup tech firms, consumer tech firms. And again, there are 2 points of view there, and beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder. What is your nuanced point of view? Because you worked in the West, you worked over the last decade or so in India, you funded companies. What is your comment on the valuation of these consumer tech companies?
So, Anurag, I think that, I've seen a few different cycles of these booms in valuations and then, down rounds that follow often over the last decade and a half, both in the US and here in India. And I think that kind of perspective is very important to keep in mind, that usually when these booms in valuations happen, they happen for a few reasons. There's a reason why capital suddenly flows in to fund some of these firms. And when that capital really wants to come in, it wants to get those stakes in those companies, no matter what the valuation at that time, because they believe that there's a much bigger upside that will follow. But what inevitably happens, Anurag, and anyone who's been in venture capital or the startup world for the last decade or 2 decades will tell you this, that inevitably after this boom comes the reckoning. The reckoning is, okay, the companies that have raised massive multi-million dollar or hundreds of million of dollar rounds now, in the latest cycle, can they justify the valuations that they've been accorded by showing that the promise that, or the potential that they were invested in on the basis of, is actually playing out or not, right? These are bets ultimately made by venture capital investors that have to play out. So then typically these companies get a couple of years to show that they can actually, when rubber hits the road, perform, right? And I think that's where we're going to enter by mid of this year. I think very soon. I think there are already signs of this. There are a lot of corrections that are starting to happen in the private markets now, because there are corrections happening even in the public markets globally. And I think that all the companies that have over the last year or so raised big rounds will now need to perform. And that performance will not necessarily come easily. Let's be very clear. A lot of these companies, I would say a big chunk of them, will have down rounds that will follow in the next year or 2, right? Where their valuations will either stagnate or even go down, right? And those are tough times. That doesn't mean that those companies will shut down. It's just that they will need to really rethink, repivot, restructure. We've seen that cycle before in 2014, 15, and even 2017, 18. So it's not going to be anything new, but you've got to keep that perspective in mind, whether you're an entrepreneur or you're an investor or you are a retail investor as well, because a lot of these companies are now IPOing. So you've got to understand this point, I think, even as a retail investor. So I think that whether these valuations are justified or not will now depend on how over the next year or 2 these companies perform or not perform. So we'll see a lot of the lesser performing players fizzle down, and then some of the new winners emerge. But new winners will emerge for sure.
Okay, Anirudh, we'll stick to your book. We'll do a separate full-blown conversation on the valuation of consumer tech companies in India in a VC world conversation, which is a community on venture capital and private equity. But back to Urvi and Vasudha for the next set of questions. Urvi, first you, and then Vasudha.
Thank you, sir. So moving ahead with the conversation, I wanted to ask you about part 2 of the book, which says that technology is the new economic destiny of nations. So can you elaborate on that? Why has technology come to be so important when it comes to something so groundbreaking like a destiny of an entire nation or the world over?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question, Urvi. So, there's a clear reference I'm making to Adam Smith's book called The Wealth of Nations that was written in the early days of the industrial era. And he talked about the wealth of nations at that time And of course, he was living in the early days of the industrial era. And I draw an analog that today we're living in the, I would say, early to mid stages of the great tech game, right, as I call it. And increasingly now, technology is shaping the economies of our nations in a way that, if I can take you back a couple of 100 years, if you were living in the early stage of the industrial era, Urvi, at that point, place yourself in Great Britain. Now, suddenly the conversation at that time in, Great Britain would have been, and in the UK would have been, okay, how many factories are we building? How many railroads are we building? How can we get the cheapest resources from the hinterland of India, a colony, to make sure that we can power our cotton mills and our textile industry, right? These would have been the conversations. And if you were the chancellor or the economic head of the government at that time, these are the kind of metrics you'd be looking at. So I make that parallel today and say, if you are the finance minister of a country today, or you're heading the economic planning unit of a country, what kind of questions should you be asking? What kind of metrics should you be looking at? Are those the metrics that you should be looking at? Or are there a whole new set of metrics that you should be looking at that will shape your digital economy now? No longer your industrial economy, but your digital economy. So in this section, I lay out what that digital economy even means. Is it just the Flipkarts and the Amazons of the world? No. Is it just the TCSs and Infosys of the world? No. There's actually a much broader framework of the digital economy that I define in my book, and I talk about the digital economy, where there's digital services, there's digital trade, there's digital manufacturing, there's digital infrastructure. All of these pieces ultimately form part of your digital economy today. And unfortunately, we don't have a very clear understanding of that broader digital economy framework, I think, even in India today. We are very much focused on one or two of the pieces, but there's a broader framework that we need to understand, because ultimately, as I argue, that's what's going to shape the destiny of not just us as a nation, but I argue all the nations in the world. That's one. Second, I talk about the fact that the conceptual frameworks that the digital economy has brought out are completely different from the industrial era frameworks. We're no longer talking about the supply chains as they existed in the industry. Right? So I have a section in the book that talks about how the supply chain of a General Motors, which I use as an example of an industrial era giant, differs from the supply chain of a Facebook or a Meta today. Right? The supply chain looks so much different. The supply chain of a GM was very lateral. You started from a raw material, you aggregated a bunch of raw materials, and then they were assembled and made into a car. And you had massive number of suppliers. For example, even today, GM has over 20,000 suppliers, or actually more than 100,000 suppliers actually. Facebook or Meta, which is a symbol of the global digital economy today, has a very different supply chain. They have a much smaller set of suppliers, right, that today exist. So they give out much less to the rest of the economy than a General Motors used to, right? Data underlies a lot of the flows of information to a Facebook that did not play a role at all in the era of the GMs of the world. And so that global digital value chain is now completely different. And we need to understand how we will compete in this new global digital value chain, right? And find our own niche in there. That's another piece I argue. And ultimately, we need to have an economic strategy. Today, the US, the Chinas of the world, the Singapores of the world, Israels of the world have a strategy in place for what their role in the global tech ecosystem will be. And so I similarly argue that as a nation, we need to understand what that role India will play in the global digital ecosystem. So I would say that those are the three main buckets of points I make in that economic section.
Right. So in that particular section, you also have a chapter named New Winners and Losers. So what is that about? That sounds like a very, it doesn't have any shades of gray to it. You're either a winner or you're a loser. So what is that about?
Yeah, so I've tried to lay out a framework there that, you might be familiar with the Human Development Index that the UN has been bringing out for now, I think the last couple of decades, that classifies countries into developed, developing, and then least developed countries. Right? Now, there are a lot of problems with that framework, but it does give you a sense of where you stand on the development index broadly as a country. So I'm arguing that today from a national standpoint, from a nation standpoint, you must understand where you are on that ladder of technological development and success, right? And that's what that chapter about winners and losers is talking about. One, a framework for you to understand all the key factors that you need to be tracking. Do you have enough broadband and internet infrastructure access for your country, or is it only limited to a certain section? Are you seeing a lot of penetration of that infrastructure and usage of that internet or not, right? That's one. Are you doing a lot of digital education of your students growing up? You know, like countries like Israel today have digital education as part of their core syllabus in the middle school and high school levels, right? As an example. Then you have the policy frameworks. Are you open in your policy frameworks to this new technological innovation that's emerging? So there are all these different factors that I described that form part of a holistic framework to understand where as a nation you stand in the global setting, right? So that's a very important piece for us to understand both in India and elsewhere. The second part of that winners and losers chapter is where I use some of the literature that exists out there to describe who are the emerging winners and losers. Today, we tend to think that the US and China are clearly the leaders, right? But what about the rest of the world? Where do all the other countries stand, right? India, we believe, you know, we are number 2 or 3 in that ladder, but really are we? Right? Just because we have the most number of, let's say, mobile phone users, does that mean that we are number 3 on that ladder? I actually argue that we are not, right? And that winners and losers chapter makes it clear that there are many other countries that on a per capita basis are doing much, much better than India is when it comes to tech adoption, tech penetration, and so on and so forth. And as India, that's a bit of a wake-up call to say that let's not rest on our laurels, but let's say, let's ask, how do we build on the foundation we've built over the last decade or two in the tech world and make sure that we are now in the top league of nations when it comes to technology. And then I outline, you know, what some of those strategies could look like, what the learnings from a Singapore or an Israel or a China or the US or even Europe could look like for India.
Yes, we all have a set of characteristics that we aspire to become efficient in our respective fields. So that's true at an individual micro level and as the macro level, like you have elaborated in that chapter. So having gained some clarity on that aspect, I would like to invite my colleague Vasudha into the conversation. So Vasudha, over to you.
Thank you, Urvi. And thank you, Anirudh. You know, at the minute you mentioned Wealth of Nations, I was transported back to undergraduate studies. That was all the, you know, we never got enough of Adam Smith. But, you know, coming back to the book and talking about, you know, production and change and how exchange, how that has completely transformed with technology. You know, the next section in your book, we've already kind of talked about it. It's your favorite part. But, you know, to do it a little bit more justice, I would like to ask you, you know, why is this your favorite part? I mean, there are huge implications here, right? It is absolutely a turning point in history. And even now, it's still a changing point. You know, there's so much going on in the world with Ukraine and stuff. But, you know, can you tell me, like, what was it about this chapter? Was it one of the first sections that you wrote? Like, what was it about it that made you want to go like, yes, this is going to be my most favorite thing. This is what I'm most passionate about. This is going to make the biggest impact in the book.
Yeah. No, thanks so much, Urvi. And, you know, I was an economics major in undergrad as well. So Adam Smith, you know, if you studied in...
she is Vasudha. Anirudh, she is Vasudha. This one is Vasudha.
Sorry. Vasudha, if you've studied in the West, right, as you were mentioning, you've also studied in Switzerland. If you've studied in the West, then Adam Smith as an economics major was one of the first things you get exposed to when you learn about the invisible hand and so on and so forth. And so, of course, that, you know, as an economics major, made its way into my book as well. But, you know, a question about why that geopolitics section is my favorite, or why that is a section I'm very excited about. See, ultimately, I think it comes down to my worldview. My worldview is that ultimately geopolitics, geoeconomics, and the competitiveness of nations is all interlinked. You cannot separate out any of these pieces. If you don't understand the geopolitical trends or currents, and you only focus on the economic piece, you will at some point have a disadvantage. If you're only playing the geopolitical game, but not the economic game, you will again be a laggard, right? Pakistan, in my mind, for example, is a classic case which has gotten obsessed with geopolitics, right? and its place in the geopolitical alliances of the world, but it does not have a clear economic strategy, right? So in my mind, unless a nation gets a bunch of these pieces together right, it fails to succeed as a nation, as a people. And that's why, in a way, this section is my favorite, because it combines geopolitics and geoeconomics in that section. I talk about both how important the security of internet infrastructure, undersea cables, etc. is, how alliances and friendships are now being determined by your tech capabilities. Today, Israel is a very attractive friend or ally for many nations in the world because it is so strong on certain technological capabilities, cybersecurity, for example, right? Similarly, Australia, I talk about how Australia, which otherwise was not featuring in many geopolitical conversations in the past, is suddenly becoming a very active participant of geopolitical constructs in the world, whether it's the Quad that is emerging, or even India and Australia now building a very strong bilateral partnership. So I ask, okay, why? Why is suddenly Australia, which otherwise, in the Indian context, has only been known to Indians as a cricket rival of India, right? Why is suddenly Australia becoming important? Because Australia, for example, is the second largest reserve of rare earths or critical minerals that form the core of the supply chain for semiconductors. And as you know, as many of us know, semiconductors are the core element of mobile phones, solar panels, our laptops, a whole lot of electronic devices today. So now Australia is second to China after that. And so suddenly Australia becomes a very attractive ally or friend to many countries, including India, who want to not be dependent on China for their supply chains in the tech economy, right? So now suddenly you're seeing that tech is shaping geopolitics in very interesting ways. But that's one piece. The second piece of the geopolitics is the battle for markets. A year or two ago, there was a lot of conversation around, okay, who will win in 5G? And suddenly the US was creating clean 5G networks. So they were saying, okay, do not adopt Huawei technology, do not adopt Chinese technology when it comes to 5G, because it will lead to geopolitical problems later. Now, of course, there was a geopolitical element to it. All of these technology layers that the Huawei's of the world were building were also being built by US and European companies. So one could argue that it was a purely geopolitical game, but I point out that it was not just a geopolitical issue. It was also very much an economic dominance issue, where whoever would win the 5G game, or for that matter, who will win any of the games in emerging technologies, whether it comes to 5G or artificial intelligence, will end up having a massive economic advantage. The US and Europe know that, right? And so they want to make sure that it's US and European companies that end up being winners in that economic game when it comes to new technological markets as well. That's why India becomes such an attractive market to US companies and European companies, because the Chinese have kept them out. And then if the second largest consumer market in tech keeps them out as well, then of course they'll have a much smaller field to play on. So I think it's that interplay of geoeconomics, geopolitics, and strategic affairs that I really enjoy, and I believe is it frames my worldview at least, and that's why that section is the most, I guess, for me, the favorite one.
Yeah, no, I can definitely see that, and I was just thinking when you were talking about the Huawei situation, how they tried to keep China out, and then you have Facebook, somehow being responsible for the elections in the US. So it's like you never really know what tech company, what tech platform is going to kind of like come and change the game or affect your own politics and economy. And I think the next part is actually the title itself, Rules of the Great Tech Game. Please tell us what are the rules? I think we all really want to know, because I don't think it seems like it's all just going a little bit crazy. But when you put it into a game format, we're like, okay, this is organized, but the rules are, of course, what's going to determine what's going to happen next. So please tell us.
Yeah, so Vasta, I'll again start off with the historical analogy. Right? So when the last great game transition happened and the US became the dominant power, they very clearly set the rules of the game that time. And that took the form of the Bretton Woods institutions, the UN, WTO, World Bank, IMF, all these institutions that many of us are familiar with. And that was really how they set the rules of the game at that time, the US. And today now we are in an era where, as I mentioned earlier to Anurag, that the world order is changing. We are increasingly moving towards potentially a multipolar world where there's no longer just one dominant power, right? And so now the question becomes, how will the rules of the game get set this time around? right? Who will set the rules? What will those rules like? And what will be the institutional framework that will govern those rules, right? And I explain in this section that you can think about how these rules of the game will get set at two levels. One is at the global level, and the second piece is the domestic level. So let me talk about the international piece first, and then I'll come to the domestic one. At the international level, what's happening is that a lot of the global governance institutions like the UN, WTO, etc., that exist today are seeing massive tug of war. Usually, which sees the US and its European allies on one side. Usually, Europe tends to break out sometimes, but usually they're there together. And then the Chinese, Russians, and many of their friends in Africa, Latin America, sometimes on the other. This battle is most interestingly being played out on the tech governance side. Many of us are not familiar, but a lot of the tech governance rules are being laid out in institutions that some of us might not have heard of, like the ITU, International Telecommunications Union, ITU, which is, again, a relic of the Telegraph Network days I was referring to earlier. And then there's also a body called ICANN, which sets a lot of the technical rules and standards for the internet and the web. And these institutions are seeing a massive internal battle between the groups I was just referring to on who will set the protocols, the standards, which companies will be the ones whose standards get adopted globally. And this is again a geo-economic and geopolitical game being played out, right? And there's many interesting instances I've referred to in this section about how the US has sometimes lagged in this game of controlling or influencing the standards when it comes to technology. And the Chinese have been very active in making sure that the ITUs of the world have many representatives of China in there to govern what kind of rules, protocol, standards become adopted on a global scale. I also mentioned from an Indian standpoint that this is a key gap in what we have done. We are not present in these global tech governance institutions at all, almost. So we really need to up our game when it comes to these governance institutions. In my mind, will be the next set of, 30 years later, we'll not be talking necessarily about just the UN, but we'll be talking about organizations or institutions like the ITU. And India must have a seat at the table, as I say. Much like we've been still trying to get our seat at the UN Security Council, I argue that this time around, we must be at the table early on so that 20 years later, we're not trying to get in the door. The second piece is at the domestic level. There's a tug of war going on between big tech firms, which are obviously massive geopolitical and geoeconomic players in our world today. I, of course, draw parallels with many of the older, large private players that have governed our world, whether it was the East India Company or whether it was the AT&Ts of the world in the 1980s. So I say that these geopolitical players, the big tech firms, and we've seen this, Anurag, in the case of Russia and Ukraine, the big tech firms have definitely come out as geopolitical players. Microsoft, for example, has been a big part of the Ukrainian cyber defense team, I would say, right? So there's this tug of war going on between these big tech firms and the state or governments in many nations. Anurag, of course, alluded to the case of Russia and Yandex having a tug of war with the Russian government. In India, we've seen some battles play out between the Indian government and some of these big tech firms. In Australia, we've seen this play out between Google and Facebook and the Australian government. The US is going through its own churn of potential antitrust actions against some of these big tech firms. So this tug of war is likely to continue because governments ultimately do not like ceding control of certain sovereign functions, currency, regulation, defense, and so on and so forth. And when big tech firms start to trade on some of these domains, there's an inevitable battle, right, for control and influence that will continue to happen between these new emerging geopolitical players, the big tech firms on one hand, and governments across countries, right? And I think that's a key challenge again for India to tread very carefully. We can't not have these big tech firms today, right? And that's the challenge. But we also cannot let them take over government, society, and media in ways that are not necessarily good for our nation, right? And I have a section that talks about digital colonialism as well. Are these guys the modern day equivalents of the East India Company? I'm not so sure. I don't think they're there yet. But we also want to make sure that they do not get there, because it's sometimes a slippery slope. The East India Company started off as a trading entity ultimately acquired military and geopolitical roles. And today, while the big tech firms are very much economic players as we see them, there's no reason to say that 30 years or 50 years down the line, they might not assume much bigger geopolitical or military roles to protect their economic interests. So we have to learn the lessons from the colonial era and make sure that this time around we are playing the game right and making sure that that balance is maintained between economic growth and, I would say, economic sort of broad-based economic growth. Right? It shouldn't get concentrated in the hands of a few.
Anirudh, I want to ask the last question. If you had to make 3 predictions for the future, and clearly, no one knows the future, not even astrologers. But okay, let's not call it prediction. What are the mega trends, 3 mega trends, especially in the context of India, that we may need to take congruence of and position ourselves well? For example, you mentioned a seat at the table where international telecom laws, internet governance issues are being discussed, right? So what are the 3 other trends that will emerge in a big way, which we are not paying attention to right now? Or not enough attention? Or not enough attention?
Versus predictions, because I think only it'd be very foolhardy in such a dynamic world to necessarily make clear predictions. But I think I'll point out 3 trends, 3 big trends. And I've alluded to them, I think, in the course of our conversation, which has been quite wide-ranging. And I'll break them down by geopolitical, economic, and societal. We've spoken about governance just now, so I won't touch on that. See, geopolitically, I think the broad trend, Anurag, is that we have to brace ourselves for much more conflict, much more intense competition in the coming years now, right? I think that, as I say in the book, Pax Americana, which was this period of relative peace, where there was a unipolar, is coming to an end or will come to an end sooner or later now. And we are now entering what I call...
And you wrote the book before the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Some of these recent,
at least 20 days before that.
Yeah. No, so the timing was very good from that perspective. So I think, but we have to brace ourselves. And I think as India, again, to bring it back to India on this, I think we must be clear on what our geopolitical strategy is going to be this time around. We don't want to have a muddled strategy. We should have a clear strategy on who and what will give us what we need, which in my mind is economic growth. So who will give us the tech, who will give us the capital, who will give us the supporting pieces that we need as a country to grow fast economically. And that should really shape our geopolitical choices as well. That's one. Second broad trend I will talk about is on the economic side. I think on the economic side, we must understand as policymakers, as individuals, as young India, that the game has changed and that technology will be the future determinant of not just economic destinies of nations, as I was saying earlier, but also our individual economic destinies, right? I talk about the future of work a little bit. Ultimately, you don't want to be set with skills that are no longer relevant. You don't want to be in jobs that will increasingly become irrelevant. You don't want to be in a position where you're like, I don't understand this at all, right? So you have to, whether you're an individual, whether you're a family, position yourselves for the fact that we're living in an era where tech will shape our economic destinies no matter what field you're in, whether you're in media, whether you're in commerce, whether you're in even in agriculture, right? Or whether you're in traditional industry. Tech will shape your destiny. So make sure that tech is very much an integral part of whatever productive activity you're part of. If you are looking to raise capital or fund your company, also even in a traditional sense, also be cognizant, okay, what is the tech factor of production that I'm going to include into my activity, right? So that's the second piece on the economic side. The third piece is societal. We haven't touched on that. So I'll spend a couple of minutes on that, Anurag. As society, the industrial era completely transformed our society, right? We went from large families, for example, to nuclear families. That was very much a factor of the industrial era impact on society. We went from being much more spread out to being a lot more concentrated into cities, right? And these urban agglomerations. We made a lot of energy choices back then that today we are bearing the brunt of, right? On the climate and ecological side. So today, tech is again having a similarly transformative impact on our society, on our values, on how we live, what kind of societal structures, what kind of cities we have, what kind of spread of people we have. And I think, again, this presents a new set of choices that we must make very, very carefully. On the climate side, for example, we have to make better choices. We cannot repeat the mistake of the industrial era, right? It's going to be hard enough for us to fix the legacy problem that we have. We must make sure that we're not adding to that problem from the choices on the energy side that we make this time around, one. Second, from a society standpoint, we've heard a lot about digital distraction, us being addicted to our phones. My last chapter talks about that. What's the impact on human behavior and values? We are becoming very short-term oriented as people.
And culture.
Culture. That's absolutely right. The impact on our culture and our values is massive. We don't talk about that enough. We don't have enough people talking about the impact of tech on culture, tech on values.
More sleep-deprived people, because people are not sleeping early. They're always on their phone.
Always on the phone. You're not getting good sleep because the first thing you look at is the phone. The last thing you look at is the phone. And I refer to a very interesting example in the book when I say that, the leaders of yesteryear, the Gandhis of the world, the Mahatma Gandhis of the world were reading Leo Tolstoy, were reading like long treatises. We talked about Adam Smith, Karl Marx, Leo Tolstoy. They were reading long, substantial treatises that shaped their worldviews. How is the worldview of today's leaders being shaped? Twitter, which orients you for short-term thinking, for bite-sized analysis of things, right? Now, the reality is that has its role in society. But if you are going to get disconnected from longer-term thinking, from deeper analysis, more broad-based analysis, what are the kind of decisions you're likely to take as leaders, whether on the corporate side or on the political side, right? And so if short-term thinking, many, an earlier president in the US was sometimes criticized for that, right? The previous president was criticized for taking very myopic, short-term sort of thinking led decisions. And we have to understand if leaders become like that. Sorry?
Impulsive. I added the word impulsive.
That's exactly right. So if you're going to have impulsive leaders, short-term thinking oriented leaders who analyze issues at a superficial level, then you have to project that forward and say, are we going to live in a world that emphasizes diplomacy? Or are we going to live in a world that is always on the brink of brinkmanship, right? Because that's sort of somehow how your brain has gotten wired. I argue that the world we are living in today is rewiring our world, our minds, into thinking in very different ways. And unless we take a very mindful approach to say we must shape technology as much as it's shaping us, we're going to end up being slaves to how the current design of technology is rewiring our brains. So we must take a step back and as a society say, what are the values that we hold dear, Annurag? Like, what are those values that we hold dear? If long-term thinking, deep analysis, moderation in our action, right, are the kinds of values we as a society want to emphasize, then we must design technology to shape, to be in sync with that. Right?
Absolutely.
We can't have technology being shaped and designed that always about, okay, spend all your time on the internet, spend all your time on your phone, go from this thing to the other and the next, right? So I think that human values and behavior and culture, as you rightly pointed out, is something that we have to have a lot more conversations on and bring in a wide range of people. Technology today is being shaped by a small section of people, engineers and product managers and founders. It can't be like that. It can't be.
Absolutely.
Like that. We have to have sociologists.
Totally agree with you.
Everyone
go on
that.
talking to you for the next 1 hour. We've been talking to you for an hour plus, an hour and 10 minutes. We'll have to halt it here, but I would like you to hold your book and show it to our viewers and readers. And for those who have missed this conversation, which is very rich and had lots of takeaways, you can watch it on the YouTube channel of Businessworld or read it in the next issue of BW Businessworld. This is Anirudh Suri and the Great Tech Game. I definitely recommend this book to somebody who wants it to have a context of what the future holds for us because of the choices we've made in the past. So wish you luck, Anirudh Suri, in the success of this book. And I'm sure it'll be a bestseller and, more importantly, impact the right kind of mind to make the right kind of decisions. Thank you from me, Urvi and Vasudha, for being in conversation with us today. We thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope our viewers and readers did. And we look forward to more conversations with you about technology, about culture, and about the fate of nations. Thank you, Anirudh. Congratulations. Goodbye. Good evening.